Greetings and welcome to this third mini lecture. And so far in the first two mini lectures, one of the major themes, in fact, I would claim that it is the major theme, is that democracy is contradictory. It's paradoxical. It is composed of things that seemingly contradict one another. For example, I told you that in democracies there is this battle between authority and order on the one hand versus liberty or freedom on the other. If you go too far in the direction of either, you have problems. For example, if you believe that democracy is primarily a procedure and in majority rule, we know that power corrupts and that majorities have abused the rights of minorities, that majorities have enslaved them, they've persecuted them, and when I talk about minorities, I'm not talking about just race here. It could be religion, it could be political conviction, it could be lifestyle, it could be a variety of things. So if you give too much power to the majority, you risk a political evil that I'm going to call tyranny throughout the course. On the other hand, if you go too far in protecting minority rights, if you go too far in being a principled Democrat, well, that isn't really democracy either. If people can just do whatever in the heck they want without limits, that's not democracy. That is anarchy, and that is just as big an evil. And many, including myself, would claim that that's a bigger evil. So the first big paradox of democracy, and you should remember this for exam purposes, is that majority rule may not be compatible with minority rights, that there needs to be this balancing of authority and freedom. The second contradictory element is that when people use the term democracy, they typically mean very different things. And so I introduced you to the concept of direct democracy in the last mini lecture. And remember, the key in a direct democracy is that citizens make laws themselves, and you should put some stars there. That is likely to be a potential exam question. And what I pointed out is that some cities, like the New England town meeting, would be an example of direct democracy. The initiative process in California would be an example of direct democracy. The classic historical example, the historical example of ancient Athens would be a classic example. But you will notice that I did not mention American national government. At the national level, we do not have any examples of direct democracy. And so with the second system of democracy that you can follow along in your notes under small number 2, indirect democracy or republic, the key addition obviously here are representatives. And Greenberg and Page gives a lengthy discussion about what a republic that is meaningful means. I listed a few, but I think Greenberg has an excellent discussion in this first chapter, that leaders are selected in competitive elections. The elections are fair, they're free, high quality information is available to voters. The majority rule in this case creates significant legitimacy. Now, Greenberg points out that in America, we have some potential problems with this. The assumption is that there is significant turnover, meaning that people are defeated. And certainly in the United States, there is a lack of turnover in Congress since World War II. Over the last 75 years, 92 or 93, depending on which source you look up, 92 to 93% of House members seeking re-election have won. If you're following the news stories, there are various allegations about whether voter suppression exists, whether or not voter turnout is lower than in any other democratic societies. Greenberg points out that many people make the claim that high quality information is not available, that a lot of the news stories that we hear has false or biased information. And one thing that I would suggest that you do, and I would suggest this for everyone who's in the class to try this, I would have you seek out and just do this for, say, 2 half-hour segments. So for those of you in here who consider yourself conservative, go to a liberal station, say MSNBC, and watch the news coverage for half an hour one day and half an hour for another. For those of you in class who consider yourself liberal, go to a conservative news outlet. For example, on cable, go to Fox News and watch over 2 days, say for half an hour or so. And see what effect this has on you, because most commentators believe that people seek out information that merely reinforces what they already think. So in other words, the vast majority of people who watch Fox are conservative, or the vast majority of people who watch MSNBC is liberal. And one of the dangers that I think this does is that we demonize each other and we tribalize each other. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later when I get to elections. But to me, in electing representatives, this is really dangerous, because as a young person, when I looked at Democrats and Republicans, when most people my age, when we were your age, when we were young, so in my case, I'm going to be 62 years old next month. So 45 years ago, when I watched the news, the news really was not an interpretation of the news. Certainly, there were commentaries, and you knew if that person was liberal or conservative. But newscasters read the news and really didn't put a slant or a bias on it. Today, the vast majority of news, certainly if you listen to cable news, CNN, MSNBC, Fox would be three examples. There are others, One American News, the BBC. There's a variety of examples. Oh, excuse me, I need to sneeze. Well, I think I repressed it. If not, I'll make faces the rest of the hour. But certainly, we listened to the news and we interpreted it. Now, some commentators are saying, well, if people just watch news they agree with, they're just merely reinforcing their opinion. They're not brainwashing them. They're merely giving them evidence for their position. But I find this highly unsatisfactory. And so I actually listen to a lot more talk radio when I'm in the car from commentators who I fundamentally disagree with, because I find it more interesting than merely regurgitating what I think. Now, if you go down to delegates and trustees, this gets into a really important discussion about indirect democracy. And here I showed you my dorky supposed circles before. I think I did a little bit better today. You can let me know if I did or not. But if you take a look in an indirect democracy, people vote for representatives, and the representatives then make laws for us. And so the key distinction here is, if you vote for a representative, what do you believe their job is? And I'll just give you my own bias, and you can you can let me know what you think in one of the discussion boards, or you can email this to me if it makes sense. I'd like to interact with you a little bit, and certainly because this is asynchronous, you don't have the opportunity to ask a question online, but certainly you can ask me a question. If I think it's good, then I will weave it into a future discussion. But for me as a voter, what I believe is that I'm the boss, and that people who run for elected office, whether it's a city councilman, whether it's a state legislator, whether it's a congressman, these candidates are involved in a job interview. And I learn a lot about them by following the news, listening to their speeches, or whatever it happens to be. and then ultimately I hire them to do a job for me. And if they do their job well, then I'm going to continue to vote for them. But if they don't do their job, then I'm going to vote against them and I'm going to fire them. And think about this in your own life, right? Perhaps one of you have gone to a dentist or a car mechanic or somebody to do a job for you. You don't tell them how to do their job. You make the assumption that they're qualified to do it. And if you get good service, then you're likely to go back. And if you get bad service, then you fire them. And I think that's the way we as voters should treat our elected officials. We shouldn't tell them how to do their job, just like we wouldn't tell a lawyer or a doctor or a car mechanic. But if they don't do their job well, we have an obligation, and that obligation in this particular case is to vote them out of office. Now, I have listed two things, and I would put stars here. Either or both of them could appear on the exam. Most Americans, about 80%, this isn't in the notes, but in most surveys, about 80% of Americans are delegates. And delegates believe that representatives should vote the wishes of the people. Certainly, this is a more democratic notion, but certainly there can be a huge problem. For example, if people are uninformed, if they don't have very good information. So in this particular case, it's more democratic. It may or may not be better. About 20% of Americans believe in the notion of trusteeship. Now, these people believe that representatives should vote the interest of the people as he or she sees fit. Now, of course, the big problem here is that if we're investing a lot of power in our representative, and I would underline the statement by Lord Acton, you may see it in the future, right, that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there may be a real problem with representation if your representatives don't share much in common with the people they represent. So think about our Congress. We know in studies of Congress that new Congress people tend to lean towards being delegates. The longer that congresspersons are in office, the more and more likely they are to become a trustee. They have greater job security. They don't believe that a mistake is going to cost them. There are problems, obviously, with either of these notions. If the people are uninformed, it can be devastating. I will, at the start of the next lecture, illustrate this with Great Britain in the interwar period. If you take a look at a survey of British public opinion after Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, the people of Great Britain overwhelmingly believed that Hitler was a good guy. He was a moderate. He had been wounded in World War I. He would do anything possible to avoid being in a second World War. And therefore, they urged their representatives to work with Hitler diplomatically. And of course, the people were wrong about Hitler. He wasn't a peacenik. He didn't want diplomacy. He was a war lover. But elected officials knew what the people wanted, and they gave them exactly that. The problem with trusteeship, of course, as I mentioned earlier, power corrupts. So if people do not believe that the people will throw them out of office, their arrogance can sink deeper and deeper into their veins than they think possible. It can become very corrupting. These individuals can make the lazy assumption that their interests are synonymous or the same as the people they represent, and in many cases they don't. If the representative is more affluent, is older, they may have very different interests than the rank and file voting. I will explain in the next mini lecture why I'm in the minority, why I believe in trusteeship, although I acknowledge that that position can have huge problems as well.